Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in this evening. Janet Dermody here with Cape Breton Originals. We have Dr. Chris Milburn and Tina Olivero. The reason why I'm doing these podcasts on the opioid crisis is, as you all know, my brother Brian, he died with a fentanyl overdose. And with that, it makes me very passionate for the cause and to create change and hope. So, Tina, tell them why you do it.
Yeah, hi everybody. So I'm the founder of Guardians of Recovery. I'm here in St. John's, Newfoundland right now. My son Ben was tragically lost last summer to a fentanyl overdose, and it has been the most difficult thing I've ever had to survive. He was sick for 7 years with addiction, brain illness, and I've spent every waking moment since then trying to help other parents, moms, dads exactly like me in the exact same situation. So we formed a nonprofit, Guardians of Recovery. We now have programs. I hear from 2-3 moms every single day who have kids on death's door. So firsthand knowledge and experience every day trying to get help for these people. We're coming up against all kinds of obstacles, all kinds of opposition. Just a tragic situation based on the number of deaths that we're having. But tonight we're so excited to have Chris Milburn here to talk about things from a doctor's perspective and really get an inside scoop and a different conversation about what's actually happening from a medical perspective on the opioid scene. So welcome, Chris. Thank you so much to the show.
Oh, thank you guys for thinking to have me. It's very kind of you, and I'm flattered to be on. Thanks.
Thanks. So, Doctor, I see you're on TikTok videos and you're speaking out regarding what's going on with the opioid crisis. So what motivates you to do what you're doing?
So I'm a born and raised Cape Bretoner. I grew up in Sydney, and my family is originally from Glace Bay. And a lot of people, depending on where they're listening from, they may not know, but the way I've described it to people is Cape Breton is Canada's version of Appalachia. You know, it's that kind of place where it was used to be coal mines and industry, and everybody worked, and there were tight-knit communities. And then the economy kind of fell apart. And for Cape Breton, that was really starting in the 1940s and 50s. The economy kind of disintegrated bit by bit. The need for coal went way down. We had 40,000 coal miners, didn't need them anymore. Fishing kind of died bit by bit. The steel plant died bit by bit. So all of a sudden we had all kinds of unemployment, and really an environment that was really, really ripe for unemployment and eventually addictions. And so we were the heart of the opioid crisis in Canada when it first hit, really in the 1990s. And that was the prescription opioid crisis, the OxyContin crisis. Right. And people could actually watch it online, but there's a great documentary called Cottonland, which is really worth watching, about that and how it hit Cape Breton. And as a Cape Bretoner, I kind of saw that hit some of my contemporaries, so some people I grew up with, but one of my close family members ended up getting addicted to prescribed drugs, prescribed opioids. Right. And so I kind of watched that happen. So not only did I see it first happening from afar, because I worked in Ontario for the first part of my career, but when I moved back to Cape Breton in 2003, I had an up close, front and center seat to watch it happening, both in my job, but also, like say, in my own family. So it's near and dear topic to me for many years.
Not getting to the question list, but what did you do for 20 years here in Cape Breton? What was your main job role?
Yeah, well, I'll say I'm complicated. I've done a lot of different things through my career. I started off my work career as both a rural family doc in a small farming community outside of Kingston, Ontario, but I also always did quite a bit of emergency medicine. But I've also been involved with public health. That's the other thing that's relevant to this conversation is I've been involved with public health more or less for 20 years, including being quite involved at the national and provincial levels. I was a member and then head of the CMA, what was basically the public health committee. And I helped to craft their position paper on opioids. And then I was a member and then eventually the chair of the Doctors Nova Scotia Public Health Committee. And so we definitely ran into some issues with opioids at that time too. So went mainly in Cape Breton. I've mainly been an emerge doc, but I've always kept a foot in family medicine. And then when I ran into, well, how can I put it politely? When I ran into a few headwinds when I spoke out against COVID policy in 2021, I stopped my work as an emerge doc and head of emerge for the Eastern Zone. And now I'm a old-fashioned small village family doctor here in Canso, Nova Scotia, a little tiny fishing community, and I'm actually here in my office tonight.
Right on. We're so excited to have your experience, because that is exactly where we want to go and be able to talk about, what it's actually like in the emergency room, what's happening at the level of policy, why are we at this crisis at the level that we are. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So we'll get into the questions. So one of the first questions that we thought was, what made you first question the harm reduction program and the safer drug supply program in Canada?
Well, I think anyone who is not just what would you say, a mindless robot automaton, anyone who thinks for themselves was really scratching their heads right from the beginning on this issue. Because when you look at the history of programs to help people with addictions, let's stay specifically narcotic addictions, like methadone programs have actually been around since the 1950s. Most people don't know that. Yeah, they're not a new thing. But a methadone program, it was called a program. It wasn't just called methadone, it was called a methadone program. And the best way I've heard it described is that the methadone was maybe 10% of the program, but the active ingredients were everything else. So you went into the program, and the program involved counseling because maybe you had mental health issues. It involved getting connected with family. It involved getting off the street if you're on the street. It involved getting a job and getting a purpose in life, and maybe going to church, that spiritual thing. Why am I here on earth? All of those things were known to be important. So 90% of the program was all the counseling and the finding the meaning and finding something to do with your day other than inject drugs into yourself. And the methadone is just 10%. And it was temporary. There's never an idea, even in the night. I started med school in '93, and when I first learned about methadone programs, they were always temporary. It wasn't like, oh, you have a lifelong brain disease that you can never get better from, and so we're just going to slap you on this drug, just like we'd slap somebody with the thyroid doesn't work and they need thyroid medication the rest of their life. That's the way we talk about and look at methadone and now Suboxone programs now. And actually Bonnie Henry, the wonderful medical officer of health in BC, she actually said, well, people can quit alcohol, but narcotic addiction, that's a brain disease and they can never get better. So they just need to stay on drugs their whole life. And so that's a real change in our thinking. And it was never meant to be that way.
That's not my thinking at all. And I don't think it's the thinking of the majority of the country. So I think we need to actually get to the heart of that, because I don't see people, the mothers that I speak to every day that call, that have issues with their kids, that is definitely not the way they think. They don't believe that giving more drugs to their kid who's dying from drugs is a smart solution.
Yeah. How do you personally feel about it? Do you feel that that is the right approach to it?
Oh, not at all. And just sort of going to what Tina said there, it's funny because people who are close to this issue, either working directly with addicts or have an addicted person in their family, they kind of recognize, like, okay, my son / brother / aunt, she's on this methadone program, but she's still a mess. They're not doing anything for her. She goes in every day and she gets her drink of methadone, and then she goes out and she shoots up and she hangs out with these people who are disastrous, and she's still out of work. Like, we see it. We see that it's not making them better, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like Ben, my son, who died from fentanyl overdose, 2 months before he died, he was put on Suboxone. His situation was at the moment he started smoking weed, it like unlocked bipolar, and he never ever got to see a doctor. He never got into a hospital. He was living in shelters that were drug den shelters, and eventually died of fentanyl overdose. So he never really, first of all, had the right diagnosis and prognosis to what was happening They just like slapped him on Suboxone and said, that's what you need to do. And within 2 months of that, along with all the other drugs that he was taking, he died with 7 different drugs in his system. And, Suboxone, I think, was like the ending, the icing on the cake.
Yeah, it's so sad to hear these stories because I a lot of us have seen this coming for a long time. And so I'll tell you why I think that a methadone program used to be a program where methadone was a small part and temporary. And now a methadone program, or a Suboxone program more commonly now, is just go in, get your Suboxone, go home.
Yeah.
It's because um, it's kind of difficult to help people reconnect with jobs, help them reconnect with family, get them off the street, all that. That's difficult. It's really easy to just give them Suboxone every day. And the government can brag about, oh, look, like in my home community around CBRM, I think I could be wrong, but I remember seeing something in the paper ages ago about they were really proud because we have over 1,500 people on methadone and Suboxone in the community, and this was said not as, oh my God, this is a sign that something's really wrong. It was said as, it's a sign we're doing a great job. And they bragged about how many free needles they give out. And to me, again, like that is not a sign of success. That's a sign of failure in our communities.
I agree.
When we talk about it, when we count these things on spreadsheets and we say, hey, we gave out 100,000 free needles this year and it was only 80,000 last year, so we're doing better. It's like, no, we're doing worse. But the government wants to say, look at all we're doing, and it's relatively cheap and easy to do these things.
Yeah, and we're perpetuating a culture that is all roads lead to continued use of drugs instead of the opposite, all roads lead to recovery. Like we have got this completely ass for us. We need to turn the whole thing around and make sure that every single thing from the legislature, like the privacy law, I was kept out of Ben's every step, whether he was in a shelter, whether he had an overdose. I was kept out of all of that because of the privacy laws. And so, even when he was in a youth shelter, those workers they were stopped from speaking to me. And even if they wanted to tell me what kind of condition he was in, on death's door, but they were tied. So like our privacy law, everything that is, in the structure of the path that a person goes down is pointing towards continue to do drugs. Now, when I look at that, that just speaks to me of corruption.
Well, yeah, and I just noticed somebody popped up a question there. Why are they on methadone so long? I think there's a few things going on here. Like number one, as I say, governments want to be seen to be doing something. The only thing that they can count and measure and put in the paper as a success is methadone and free needles. There's another big problem, and it's interesting that you're in Newfoundland because I actually ran into a newspaper article a few years ago that it was like a sunshine list of the top earning doctors, the top 10 earning doctors in Newfoundland. And as one would expect, if they know much about medicine, 3 of them were eye doctors. They do cataract surgeries and that, and they make a lot of money. And that's, that's fine. They're working on your eyes, right? But 2 of the top 10 doctors were actually methadone prescribing doctors.
Wow.
Right. And so I think it's probably about 25 years ago, the government in most provinces changed the funding formula. So one of the most lucrative things you can do in medicine, I could make way more running a methadone clinic than I can in ER, or way more than twice as much, 3 times as much as a family practice. Easily.
I have no idea, but I do know that the number of people that are on Suboxone and methadone is just skyrocketing, especially here in Newfoundland. And for the 2 months that Ben did go to the Suboxone clinic, I would just sit there in my car and watch people come and going while they were in the parking lot doing other drug transactions, and just what people like zombies, like nothing there. Their eyes are just blotto. And to me, everything about it was wrong.
Yeah. So another question here on this, another comment. So it's basically people getting methadone in the morning and then going looking for other drugs all day long and keeping themselves into that state of being an active addiction. So why don't they do blood samples so that they make sure that the methadone is the only thing in their system, and if they are caught with anything else in their system, they're done with that program? Is there not something that they can do for that?
Well, it's funny. So you can see I put it in under my name that my wife and I write at this Paradox paradox.substack.com, and you can read what I've written about harm reduction, but there's a story specifically about that. So the way a methadone program used to work, because you were in a program, you did get your methadone, but to get the methadone, you had to sign a contract with the program.
Sign?
The contract, yeah.
I hope it's signed in blood.
So the contract that you'd signed said you agreed to attend all your counseling sessions. You agreed to, maybe if their work was a part of it, you agreed to attend work, you agreed to do this, and you agreed to random testing. It was urine testing, and they could test your urine, and they would call it, if you tested dirty, i.e. if they found out you're using something else, you get kicked out of the program.
I don't hear of that being done, doctor.
No, so that was standard. And when I started, I graduated and started work in 1999. And as far as I understand it, maybe for the first 5 or 10 years I worked, that was a standard program. If you tested dirty, you were out of the program, because the condition was you're going to get the methadone, but nothing else, because you've got to be doing all this other stuff in the program. But then it changed. And I remember the exact time when it really struck me, because I had noticed more and more that the people in methadone programs were using other drugs and coming in with overdoses on other drugs. And I thought that was strange. And I went to a big doctors conference in Nova Scotia where there's hundreds of docs, our biggest one each year. And they had an expert who ran a methadone clinic come in, right? And I put expert in quotes, and you'll find out what. Somebody asked him basically, what do you do if somebody tests dirty? And his answer shocked all of us there, because I could see people looking around. They had the same look on their faces I did. His answer was, if they test dirty, it's not a sign that they're doing anything wrong. It's a sign that their methadone dose needs to be higher, because if it was high enough, right? What he said was, if the methadone dose is high enough, then they wouldn't need to do other drugs.
Yeah, right. Oh my
Right?
God. That's so infuriating. That is absolutely. How many kids has that way of thinking killed? That's what the government needs to do, is tell us how many children, like my son, how many youth. Well, we already know the statistic. It's the number one cause of death in the country. Ages 10 to 19 is illicit drugs. So we already know the end results. All we have to do is work back from there. But that kind of thinking just pisses me off to no end. And the fact that that's not being challenged within our current government and infrastructure, and that they don't have to prove that these things are not happening as a direct result of their actions, I think is criminal.
They are criminal. And how are we ever going to hold them accountable for all of this mess that they've created? And in theory, this is because of the government's ruling and how they're helping. They're not helping anything.
Yeah. When I was sick, I was doing everything I possibly could to find answers for this. And I went to mini med school, they call it, here at MUN. And we got to the addictions section of the course. And the doctor, first thing he said, we created the opioid crisis by prescribing opioids. And it was so refreshing that those words of truth actually came out of his mouth. And I felt for the first time, okay, now that we have that truth out, we can actually start to turn this thing around. But it actually got worse, because then it went to the whole street level fentanyl, plus all the opioid prescriptions, plus all the other prescriptions that were being allowed by, like, when I took Ben to see the doctor, he prescribed him highly addictive sleeping pills on top of his addiction. Like, it's just endless.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I agree. And I think, so there's two things that come to mind as you say that. There's two things. So firstly, I think absolutely the opioid crisis was, a large part of it was the prescribing of OxyContin, these drugs that came in the early 1990s. But I don't think that's a sufficient explanation, because I think I look at it more like it poured gasoline on a fire. And the fire, to me, was kindled. People can picture it in different ways, but to me, we have a society where, 50 years ago, most of us we knew our neighbors, we went to church, we went to work, we knew our families, and we were close to our families, and very few single mothers, very few broken homes. And then just over 1 or 2 generations, we evolved. Like, how many people know all the neighbors on their street now? Not many. How many people go to church and have a church group? Not many now. How many people don't work and are home on disability and welfare and things like that? And then how many families are split, and there's all these difficult situations with moms and dads who are parenting differently and whatnot. Not to mention just our parenting style, the whole, the everybody gets a trophy generation. That was not only bad because there's many reasons it's bad, but one of the basic reasons it's bad is that we created a whole generation of kids for which there's no minimum standard. There's no expectation. You can do whatever you want and you're going to get a trophy, including like the thought of, when I was underage, the thought of bringing a bunch of booze over to my house and partying up with my friends down the basement and getting drunk, and God forbid if one of them smoked marijuana, my parents would have killed us. But now I see that as very common. A lot of parents say, "Oh, I'd rather they were doing it at home." Than, it's a we're very permissive, and all of that together, I think, has led to a lot of factors I've thrown in there, but I think it's all led to this problem.
Yeah, and on top of that, when my kids turned, Ben's one of a twin, when Ben turned 16, he got emancipated, even though he had a safe home, because he wanted to smoke weed outside the house. He wanted to bring weed in the house, and I didn't let him. And I knew, what happened to my brother, who also had cannabis use disorder, who then ended up with bipolar and schizophrenia as a direct result. I knew that was Ben's probable fate. And so I did everything I could to try and avoid that. And the more I put just normal, basic boundaries and sensible rules in place, that was considered abuse to them, and consequences like taking away your phone, or that's abusive. I'm going to get emancipated. I'm going to tell everybody that's abusive. And I'm going to go stay at Choices for Youth, where I can do anything. I can live in drug homes. I can smoke pot, do drugs whenever I want, get drugs from anybody. And I have nobody taking care of me. I have no rules. But what they don't say on the flyer for Choice for Youth is you're going to end up on the street. You're going to be malnutritioned. You're going to get Hep C. You're going to witness murders. You're going to see someone commit suicide right in front of your eyes. They forget all of that tragedy and trauma that actually occurred once Ben left home. And that to me is so wrong that these shelters and places are not giving kids the full picture, and that kids can leave home at such an early age, really not knowing anything about what could happen to them.
Yeah, the street life. So back to, but the methadone, was there an actual timeline on how long somebody should be given it? Like when they first come out with this methadone program, did they say that it would be a 6 month, 1 month, 10 month, like a year? Was there anything ever mentioned in this program of the timeline on it?
Well, I think the answer is it was different for everyone, but the typical things I'd see is somewhere from 6 months to a year. They would have a taper schedule. You'd start on whatever, 100 milligrams, and you go down by 10 milligrams a month, and you'd be off or something.
That sounds so sensible. Like, I wish we could go back to that model. I really do. I think that would make all the sense in the world for methadone to be 10% or Suboxone to be 10% of the project. It's a bridge to your recovery, and you have all these supports and programs like they do at NA. They don't say, come on in and bring your methadone and your crack. And
no. But what concerns me, Tina, is if it was meant to be a 6 month to a year long program, and as you said, doctor, that there's some of the richest or the most, doctors making the most amount of money. 2 of them were methadone prescribing doctors. I feel like this should be an actual investigation done into the methadone program itself and how it's delivered across Canada, because I think that there's a lot of corruption and doctors are keeping patients on it to better their own bank accounts rather than to help the actual people on the program, is what I feel. Is that right?
I agree. I think you guys might be very interested in it. There's a couple of little factoids that are of interest. So the first one is when somebody's on a narcotic for any length of time, they actually get more and more chronic pain. Kind of interesting. So what happens? It's called receptor upregulation. You have chemicals in these chemical receptors in your spinal cord and your brain that allow us to sense pain. And we need them because otherwise, if you lean on a hot stove, you burn your arm off and you don't know it, right? So
Right.
pain is there to help us keep from damaging ourselves. And there's people who are born genetically without that pain reception. They usually die very young because these terrible things happen that may injure themselves. They can't stop themselves from injuring themselves.
Right.
And when we try to suppress those chemicals, our body naturally makes more of them because it tries to kind of make up for the gap. So what we see is if you ask a bunch of people who are in a methadone program for addiction, if you ask them, do you have pain? A certain percentage of them will when they start the program. 6 months later, way more of them have pain. A year later, a lot of them have pain. And then when they try to stop it, they have more pain because their bodies almost needs it at that point. So we actually make it very difficult for people to get off.
I'm finding that with the people that I'm speaking to, they say that they're in chronic pain all the time. So, and it is a pattern that I've seen with the people that call me. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's the drugs. So, but there is another part of this, which again, of interest to you guys. There was a really interesting study done in Britain a few years ago on smoking cessation. And it looked at, they took a bunch of people, took half of them who wanted to quit, and it got them to taper down. So they were smoking 20 a day, and then it was 15 a day, and then 10 a day, whatever. And over 6 months or a year, they tapered down and tried to get off. And a bunch of other people, they just quit. They just went from 20 to 0, and they were cranky, and they ate everything in the house and whatever. And they looked at the number of people who successfully stayed quit. It was higher in the group who just quit.
Of course it was.
Right. And the interesting thing about that, so probably what that is when you go from 20 to 15 cigarettes, you're in withdrawal. When you go from 10, there's 15 to 10, you're in withdrawal. When you go from 10 to 5, you're in withdrawal. So you're basically in withdrawal for a year as you're tapering. And you just go nuts and you say, screw it, I can't take this. As opposed to if you just quit, you're in withdrawal for a few weeks, but you get over it. And it's actually, in a way, it's easier. It's interesting. Narcotic withdrawal has gotten this reputation that it doesn't deserve. It's got a reputation as dangerous. It's not. It just sucks. It feels awful, but literally 0 people have died in the world ever of pure narcotic withdrawal.
See?
Other drugs are dangerous to withdraw from, but it is not. And so we took it, and we took withdrawal, and we kind of made it into this huge issue. And then we said, oh, well, because withdrawal is so terrible and dangerous, now we need to put you on methadone forever. And cha-ching, 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 these methadone clinics make a lot of money.
Again, I feel it's leading down the corrupt road of somebody's making money off of this actual bullshit statement. And apologies for the frankness, but I just feel like they're making so much out of this. Places like, I don't want to name them, but
drug use. Every single narrative, from the policy to the privacy law to the criminal system, why people can't get busted for drugs, every single bit of it is perfectly architected to keep people on drugs. Like, it's nuts.
So you're a doctor, and how would you, if you had to, given the golden key to change what's going on, what steps would you take? Would you cold turkey is the way to go, or tapering down? What do you think would work?
Well, I think both can work. But I think people who are serious about quitting usually quit. The people I've seen go into methadone and Suboxone programs, it's usually because they feel they have to. It's not because, I'm very sincere about getting off this and getting a real life. In some cases it is. I shouldn't paint them all the same brush, because I met people in methadone and Suboxone programs who they don't feel good, but they're doing all right. They feel terrible on the drugs. But in general, I find that people who want to quit, a lot of them don't come to medical attention. I'll tell you a great story. There was a guy I met. He's quite a character, and I really like him. And I think he'd be the kind of guy who'd probably tell you his story too on here. If I could remember his name, get him to you. But when he was quite involved with the drug scene. He moved to Ontario from Cape Breton and was very involved with drugs, and it got, I think, a little bit wrapped up in organized crime. Was a low-level guy with them. So he's addicted himself. He's injecting. He got a call that his mom had had a stroke, and she was in the hospital, and it was not a severe stroke, and she was going to be released on Monday, but she would need help. And he loved his mom. She didn't know he was on drugs. He didn't want her to know. So this was like a Thursday. So he got a buddy of his, and he paid his buddy. He said, I want you to lock me in my basement. You can drop some food in through the window to me, the basement window. Don't let me out. I'm going to be screaming to get out. I want to get out. Don't let me out. I got to get off these. And he did. He over the weekend, he said excuse the crass language, but he shit and he vomited and he had all these side effects. And Monday morning came and he was a little shaky, but he drank a bunch of water and he got on an airplane. He went to Cape Breton and he's never used drugs since. That was 15 or 20 years ago.
I wish that had happened to Ben. I felt so many times like I just wanted to kidnap him, except I'd be in jail right now. And so many parents feel the exact same way. It's like, but like there's the part of it too with anosognosia and drug-induced anosognosia where people don't have cause and effect and they don't even recognize, like my son Ben, he'd be in the middle of winter walking down the street in November with a t-shirt on and have like zero recognition that his fingers were going to freeze. There's that too. There's most of the people that I come across that are homeless in tents, they don't have cause and effect. It's just they're so on so many drugs and they're so messed up. They're a lot of times in psychosis. They should be in hospital.
So
many of them do get to that point, and it does get difficult. So going back to something else you guys said, and I think it's in some of the questions coming up, but there's this really difficult line that we try to draw. In Canada, whether you want to smoke some cigarettes or smoke a little marijuana on the weekend or eat too much chocolate cake and get a little fat or whatever, you're kind of free to do that, even though it's bad for your health. So many of the things that we're free to do are bad for our health, right? And I'm very glad we live in a country where the government doesn't regulate everything I eat and everything I do and how much I exercise.
Right.
The downside to living in a free country is that people can do really shitty things to themselves, including do drugs. There is this line that gets crossed where people are no longer competent to make their own decisions.
Yeah.
That is very challenging because if somebody comes into me and they're clearly stoned and they can't even stand up, well, I can keep them in the emergency department or the hospital against their will. Once they're sober enough and they can explain to me, the dividing line when I have to let them go is when they are able to walk and talk, and if I'm able to have a conversation and say, look, I'm worried about you. Do you understand why I'm worried about you? And they say, oh yeah, you're worried about me because I'm doing drugs. I go out and use them again, blah, 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 blah. It's like, so you understand the risks? Yes. Well, at that point, I can't lock people up against their will.
Right, but I have a question about that. So, like in the case of my son Ben, who overdosed the day before from fentanyl, and not realizing like fentanyl stays in your system for 48 hours, and he was completely out of his mind. Like he bolted out of the hospital, and he just was not there. He went straight to the Suboxone clinic to get more Suboxone, and he overdosed again and died the next day. Like if fentanyl is in your system for 48 hours, and you've already proven that you're a danger to yourself with an overdose, is it not our responsibility to help people who can't make life-saving decisions?
It's very tough. Like I would have had to meet him at that time to understand exactly where he was at. But what I can say about that in general is, number one, fentanyl has a very short half-life. So if somebody took fentanyl 4 hours ago, half of it's already gone by the time you see them. And so they're sobering up and they can have a completely rational conversation with you. Yes, they have fentanyl in their system, but they'd be like the equivalent of if an alcoholic who's used to drinking 20 beer, is had 3 beer, he's not out of his mind. As a matter of fact, he's pretty sober for him. And so he's rational at that point. So that's one thing. The other thing is, the fact that somebody's overdosed at once does put them at higher risk to overdose again, but it doesn't say, like, if we could lock up everybody in the country who's ever overdosed, we'd be locking up 10% of the country because there's a lot of people who've overdosed. So it's a very, very difficult line to draw. And in general, in our society, we always draw the line on the side of personal liberty.
Right.
Because
but what if we had the actual figure of how many people overdosed and then died? Like, do you think that might make a difference? Because if we know that there's a direct correlation to the amount of people that overdose and then died, like right now we have 22 people a day in Canada who die from overdose. And then we have 23 people a day who actually go to hospital for, illicit drug overdose or whatever. So how many of those who go to hospital actually then go on to die? We should be able to know those figures. We should be able to predict how many of those people are actually going to die and are at risk, and what is the protocol. Like in Alberta, they have it together. The first thing you do with 24/7 emergency is see a psychiatrist, see someone who's actually going to assess you. Is that person have a mental illness? Do they have an addiction? Do they have both? Like, what are they struggling with? What's the protocol? And in the case of Ben, because of privacy law, he didn't even get to see a doctor, see a psychiatrist at all. So there wasn't a chance in hell he was going to make it.
Yeah, it is. Like, and I totally agree with what you're saying there. It is challenging. Like, an example, kind of an analogy, be if somebody posts on Facebook, "I hope Justin Trudeau effing gets shot." Should we lock them up? There's a chance that they're going to shoot Justin Trudeau, I suppose, for saying something like that. But most of them won't. And there's probably thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have posted stuff like that. But we can't lock them all up because they might be a danger to him. Whereas, and it's similar, like a lot of people have at one point in their life, they've overdosed. At one point in their life, they've said something about committing suicide. We can't lock them all up. After somebody actually is dead, it's easy to look back and say, "Oh shit, they did this, they did that, they said this, they said that, and we should have seen it." But for every one of those who actually overdoses and dies, there's probably hundreds or thousands who don't end up hurting themselves. And so that's why it's hard, because it's only after it happens we can say, "Oh God, look at that." It's all there's a joke. It's always better to be the last doctor involved than the first doctor, because by the time something bad happens, it's obvious what should have been done, right? So it is challenging.
But parents left out of the circle of care, as in my case. Like, I could have been advocating for my son the whole way. My family history, bipolar, Ben's twin sister, hospitalized 3 times as a result of psychosis. Like, and it's such a genetic illness. Like, all of that needed to come into play. People needed to listen to me, but I couldn't even get him in the hospital, let alone have someone listen to me. And the times I did take him, they were like, "Oh, well, he says that he's fine." And in his mind, he was. And he wasn't fine.
It is terrible. And, it's a different issue than the opioid issue, but you could get me going for quite a while about marijuana, because marijuana is looked at as this benign drug, and now the government sells it. So how bad could it be? And I've found it that when I'm asking people about things now, I used to say, "Do you drink? Do you smoke? Do you do any drugs?" Now I have to say, "Do you drink? Do you smoke? Do you use marijuana? Do you do any drugs?" Because if I just ask about drugs, people won't tell me about marijuana because they don't even think of it as a drug anymore, because the government sells it. So it's got to be safe, right? But it's not safe.
No, it's not. And we have 4 times more psychosis since legalization of marijuana in Canada, in our hospitals, in our psych wards. That's not being told to the public. And 1 in 6 people in, adolescents are going to get cannabis use disorder. 1 in 10 adults do. So what are we talking about? People here who are getting all this misinformation that it's all sweet and fine, but 1 in 10 people or 1 in 6 adolescents are actually going to be screwed for the rest of their life because of marijuana. And marijuana is being laced with fentanyl these days on top of it all to make it more addictive.
Yes, it's terrible. It's terrible to watch this happen. I don't know. I don't like the idea of the war on drugs, because I don't like the war on anything. But the idea that, oh, well, the war on drugs was bad, so now we just got to legalize everything and it's all fine. We got to destigmatize. I hate that word. We got to destigmatize drug use. No, there should be a stigma on drug use. It's bad for you. It's dangerous. People die of it. There should be a stigma. It's like drinking and driving. It's dangerous. It's bad for you. It's bad for your community. Don't do it.
Exactly. But we've got this society where we can walk down the street and watch someone injecting right in front of us because it's okay to use drugs out on the street. The mindset is just off the charts. And then the people who are on fentanyl, carfentanil, and coke and all that, they're having shootouts. There's random attacks. There's all these things that are happening in our society as a direct result. Like, we had to cancel the Christmas parade because people were in a shootout. Like, at what point is our government going to wake up and say, this madness has to stop? And we're just harping and harping and harping on it for years, and
With that in mind,
infuriating.
last night there was a concert here in Sydney, Doctor, at the Center 200, and everything today on Facebook has been just blowing up. There's been people that were smoking crack on the floor, smoking meth on the floor inside Center 200. There was that many people doing it. Security couldn't keep up. There was weed being smoked openly. There was children as young as 14 years old there, and this is the culture. And I think that it's happening more and more because of the safe supply places like the Alley Center here in Sydney that are defending the users in that place to the high heavens, and they're making anybody who steps up or says anything against them look like an absolute hater of people, when in fact I'm looking out for seniors, I'm looking out for the children, but I'm a bad guy because I'm looking out for the safety of my community. And I don't understand how these people are brainwashing people.
Yeah.
Well, not only, just to add to what you're saying, I completely agree. So if you look at kind of the whole push of the Ally Center, it seems to be to normalize drug use. Oh, drug use is fine. Homelessness is fine, and this is fine, and that's fine, that's fine. And it's like, it's not all fine. And
No.
not only are you defending the other people in the community by being against that, but it's actually not the best thing for these people either. That more of them die because of what's going on. So it's the worst thing for everybody, not just the rest of the community, but the users themselves. So these help centers have actually been incredibly destructive, because if you look at them, for instance, the whole harm reduction idea really started probably late 90s, and then it really gained steam in the early 2000s, mainly in Vancouver. And when you look at wherever these harm reduction programs have come in and they've started to spend more and more money and push them more and more, things have not gotten better. They've gotten worse and worse, and particularly in those communities, because some people's argument who are still for these harm reduction programs say, oh, it's not that the harm reduction program made it worse, it's just that it's getting worse. And there's some truth to that, but it is worse. The more harm reduction you have in a community, the more it kind of attracts this behavior and promotes this behavior and makes it sustainable and normal, right?
And you know what's really upsetting is, like, I get calls sometimes from people who are using in that moment, and they want someone there on the phone, or they want someone to talk to. They know that I'm Ben's mom, even people that Ben knew, and they have fentanyl strips. They take that fentanyl strip. They know that there's fentanyl in that cocaine, and they do it anyway. That's addiction. Addiction will have you do drugs even though you know it's going to kill you. I mean, drugs are so strong and so addictive that people are just out of their minds with crack cocaine and all of these fentanyl and carfentanil, and they're buying fentanyl. And in BC, you can have 2.5 grams of it, which is enough to kill 10,000 people.
Well,
one person.
The track, but in my mind, I'm thinking with programs like the Ally Center are the more they have an addiction population, the more they can hire more staff on, the more their numbers show the government that they need more funding. And I just feel like it's a line of corruption in that field of work, and it's doing nothing. That harm reduction, in my mind, I advertise it as harm production, because they're doing nothing to help the actual addicted to community. They're enticing others, and right now giving out the pallet homes here, it's almost like they're glorifying it and turning it into, I'm going to say it, a junkie's paradise. What do you think about that?
Imagine if all that money actually went. Imagine if all that money actually went to detox. Like, we can't get people into detox or rehab because there's no beds open, there's no staff. But if we had all that safe supply money going towards staff and detox and recovery, we would transform this country.
Well, doctor, I want to hear what your feelings are on this pallet shelter, and they're able to have their safe drug supply, because it's the Alley Center is running it through New Dawn. What are your feelings along how that's going to help the communities?
Well, maybe I'll come back to that, but I'll come back to it through something that Tina said. So I think there's been what would you say? There's been kind of a narrative that's being built into the drug addiction literature that people have kind of absorbed, and it's this idea that people do drugs because drugs are addictive, right? And it's like, oh well, people, once they're addicted, they just can't stop, and they keep doing drugs. They know it's dangerous, and they don't want to die, but they just keep doing drugs because it's so addictive they can't stop. In my experience, that is not true. people, there's a study called the Rat Park study, which
Yeah.
if,
Yeah, we saw that. Yeah.
yeah. So the Rat Park study, Dr. Julian Summers spoke at our Free Speech and Medicine conference in Bedeck this year, in Bedeck, Cape Breton.
That's it.
And he's an expert in this, and he actually worked on the Rat Park studies with Bruce Alexander, who was the main psychologist who did that. But what they found in the Rat Park study was a lot of the studies that had been done showing how addictive drugs were way back in the 50s and 60s were done by taking a rat, putting it in a cage all alone, and then giving it, it had a water bottle and a water bottle with morphine. And inevitably, these rats ended up using the water bottle with morphine. And so we said, oh, look how addictive it is. But the problem was the rats are social animals. They're like humans. They need family. They need a job to do. They food to hunt. They need excitement and toys to play with. They need a life. And what they found was that when you made a rat park, they call it a rat park, it was kind of like a rat paradise with all kinds of their family around and other rats and things to play with and things to do and see. The rats, you could put the morphine water in, but they hardly ever got addicted to it.
Right.
So what it showed us was that drugs aren't addictive because drugs are addictive. Drugs are addictive because people don't have better options. They are alone. They're isolated. They don't care about their future. They don't see a future for themselves. So in my experience, the ongoing use of drugs is not so much I'd love to stop, but I just can't. It's I don't really have a reason to stop, and I don't really have anything better to do. And it's like a slow suicide. I don't care if I die or not. I've heard addict after addict tell me that. It's like, yeah, I know I could die. It's like they just got nothing else going on. And so coming to the pallet shelter, I don't see any of these things as solutions. It doesn't matter. You can stick people in a pallet shelter or a palace.
I think we should have recovery resorts that are super fun, full of the arts and all kinds of really interesting things. That's what we've been trying to do at Guardians. Like we have guitar lessons and spoken word and, bring out the artist in yourself and back to work projects where you learn digital media so you can succeed in the digital media world, all in the last 6 months since Ben died. And they're all free. So that's what I feel is that if people can take those roads and really get self-expressed, I guess, if you will, and creative. Those two things are sorely missing in our society. And to be able to tell your stories in new and creative ways and be around people who care about you, understand you, and understand your challenges, can hear you, validate what you're going through. And in the process, you learn to manage your emotions, gain emotional intelligence, have the ability to self-reflect and be self-aware, and to kind of move through your life in productive ways. Like that's it. That could be architected or designed into a recovery resort. And even now, the recovery centers, like I wouldn't want to go to one of those. It's like going to a lockup.
People need, I think what it comes down to is, like I was saying, people could be in a pallet shelter or a palace, and if they don't have a purpose, if they don't have something to get up for and do in the morning, if they don't feel needed and wanted, and if they don't feel part of the community, they are going to fall back on doing drugs. And we see that people like Whitney Houston, all these people, if it was lack of money that caused people to die of drug overdoses, why are all, over and over Amy Winehouse and, you can name a million stars who are super successful and have millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, and they still kill themselves with drugs. And it's a lack of purpose. It's a floundering in life. It's not feeling connected properly and whatnot. So this whole idea that, if we take people off the streets and put them in a pallet shelters, if a pallet shelter's off the street, then suddenly that's going to make everything magically better. What bothers me is it's already been done in other communities and it's failed in other communities. And so we don't learn in Cape Breton. One of the things that bothers me, we're always 10 or 15 or 20 years behind, which would be good if we were learning. It's like, they already made these mistakes, we won't do them, but we don't seem to. We're doing what the other communities did 15 or 20 years ago and failed. And then we're just going to repeat those failures. It's really sad to see.
Yeah, it is. This country is a super sad situation. And I think that is fundamentally, a lack of purpose. And what I think where the real opportunity is, like the people who really know how to solve this thing is the people who have gone to recovery or going through recovery and can contribute to other people with that mindset and understanding and turn this whole thing around. And also the families of people who have addicted loved ones. We have that lived experience to be able to architect a whole different future based on what
Mhm.
we learned from our loved ones. So why don't they let us do it?
Mhm. Mhm.
And why don't they give doctors like yourself with a completely different view of, a harm reduction and safer drug supply? Why are they not listening to you? You've been in medicine for over 22 years and an ER doctor. If you don't know what you're talking about, how do these people that are just working in an ally center job that have, compared to you, a blip like a teardrop of experience, and they know better than you, a doctor who's got all these years of experience and education behind them? Like, it just boggles my mind on how they're brainwashing society that this is normal, that we're all going to have to get used to going to concerts and smoking, having people smoke meth. And then my next point comes in, doctor. What about the people who have recovered and are forced to be next to somebody who's actively using? How well is their recovery going to go when they're in a position that puts them at a tilting point in their life?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I see that. I've seen that numerous times where people people have told me. One guy who sticks in my mind told me, he said, "I'm getting off methadone. I'm just going to quit it. Is that safe?" And I had a big talk with him. I said, "You're going to feel terrible for a while, but absolutely it's safe, and you're not going to hurt yourself doing that, whatnot." And I believe he did successfully get off. But I asked him what brought this on. He said, "Well, going to the methadone program out every day, it just keeps me around these people they're all using other drugs. They're pushing me to do it." He said, I'm right now, I'm on the edge. I could go either way. And I know if I'm around these people, I'm going to fall back into it. I need to get away from them. And the methadone program is keeping me around them every day. And I need to get
See?
out of there. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's danger. Warning, warning. If you see a sign and it says, if you walk here, you're going to fall off the cliff. And yet that's what the alley center is to me. Danger, danger. Anybody who's using that place, I just feel they're just destroying every community that they're set up in. In Halifax, it's called the Beacon House. I mean, it's just, there's no end to these organizations fleecing the community, getting money that there's no end to the money they're getting. And they're just using their helping line while they're hurting every person that they touch.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that people have described it to me like they feel like a slave to methadone. They every single day they have to get to the clinic. They have to line up in front of shoppers. Like how humiliating they must feel. Like my heart breaks. And
Mhm.
when there's a snowstorm, they can't get there. There's all kinds of issues. And your only alternative is if you get an injection for a whole month and you have no idea what it's doing to your body. Like I believe when we see the long-term effects of what Suboxone does to your body for 10 years, your brain, what it does to your teeth, like if it does that to your teeth, imagine what it's doing to your brain. It just makes no sense to me. And I feel so bad that people are kind of brainwashed, if you will, that they have to take this thing, that they can't actually get through life because of it, when in fact, there's a great big world out there with their name on it, and they can do anything.
You guys may be really interested in some of the people who are tuned in. There's a book. It's a little hard to find, but you can still find it online. It's called Romancing Opiates, and it's by
Yeah.
my favorite author. His name is Theodore Dalrymple, who was a physician who worked in prisons in Britain for many years. And he's a psychiatrist for many years, and he talks about some of the things that I've talked about. How we've made narcotic withdrawal. We've talked about it and scared people so much about it that now they're afraid to stop narcotics. And he talks about the history that people used to stop all the time, all the time. You
Yeah.
look at the 1960s and 70s, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles,
Yeah.
you name the rock star, they were addicted, and then they just went to the Betty Ford clinic for the weekend, and they had all the withdrawal symptoms, and then by Monday they were clean. They did that
Ben,
all.
Ben came off opiates 3 separate times on his own completely. His addiction was weed. And he didn't really care that much about opioids. But it was Suboxone. When he went on Suboxone 2 months later, he was dead.
See, if we don't, in my mind, I feel if we don't start using the cold turkey or the winding down, reducing the amount that we're giving them, removing programs like the Alley Center, what is going to be in our future in 10 years from now? Because it reminds me of the Pantene commercial, and you tell 10 friends and they tell 10 friends and so on and so on, because I just feel that this is exponentially growing as a problem. And it's not just a family problem. It's not just, a me or a you problem. It's turning into a community problem when we can't even go somewheres, and we have to worry about going into a public bathroom because they've got blue lights in there because there's people in there shooting blood, or they're shooting their veins up and getting high, and there's blood everywhere. And we have to explain all these things to small children, and we're scared to use a public bathroom now, and we're scared to go to a concert like what happened at Center 200 last night. If we don't start retraining people that this is wrong, it's just going to keep becoming a bigger problem.
Yeah.
I agree. Maybe a couple of comments on that. One of the things that people don't realize, going back to something I said before, it's not just that these aren't helping. It's that they're making them worse. We have the highest death rate ever, and it keeps climbing each year, which means all of these addicts are dying each year, but there's new ones replacing them. So there's actually more and more people getting addicted every year, as well as more people dying.
Is there ever?
Just to kind of tell a couple of stories, and again, people can read this on the Substack that I've written, but there's 2 stories that have stuck with me over the years. So one was a young guy who came in and he wanted to get off drugs, and he had run into some issues, brought him into the Emerge late at night. And he was a really smart young guy, really smart. And you could tell he was a nice guy, he's polite, he was smart. And I had to ask him, I said, how did a young, smart guy like you, how did you get going? Like, tell me about the first time you shot up. And he told me, he said he was at a party, he was on grade 12 at a party or having some drinks, and some of the guys were smoking a little weed or whatever. And he went out back, and they were having the party out in the man cave out in the garage out back. And he walked in, and there were some guys shooting up. And his friend said, oh, why don't you try some of this? And he said, I was kind of afraid of this and that, but my buddy was experienced. He said, no, we won't give you too much. We'll just give you a little bit. It's really fun. And he said he never would have done it, except there was a whole supply of free needles there from the Ally Center, clean needles. So he knew that he was going to be safe from diseases. And I asked him, I said, would you have ever used it if it was a dirty needle, if it was shared needle? He said, I'm not stupid. He said, I've never used a shared needle in all my 4 years doing drugs. He had constant free needles from the Ally Center the whole time. And he's not a guy, if it was dirty needles or no needles, he would have quit. But he always had clean needles. So you look at that and you just say, did those clean needles, maybe they help some people?
Yeah.
Maybe. But they also probably hurt some people by making it more normal to be on drugs, and more easy to be on drugs.
Yeah, by an enabling type of mentality. So a couple of takeaways for our people who are watching at home: Romancing Opioids, which is the book to have a look for; Cottonland, the show; and also Painkillers show. There's a lot of opiate shows out there right now. So that's 3 resources. Hopefully you guys can get your hands on it. And Guardians of Recovery is here as well for people to contact us, guardiansofrecovery.foundation. And we want to hear your comments. We want to hear your stories. So if you want to come forward with stories and you want to share your lived experience, we're happy to do that, especially if you have a recovery story that can inspire other people to cross that bridge. And we'd love to learn from you.
Yes. Now, Doctor, I see that you've got a website down there in the bottom. I can't quite see it. Paradox.substack.com. Is that what it is? Could you put it in the comments so we can find you?
Yeah, I will. So my wife and I, my wife is the good writer, and I kind of try to contribute, but we write at this site, so I'll put it in the chat. Okay. But people are free to look there, and we did write. I did a 4-part series on the whole harm reduction thing. And it's available both as a podcast, but also if people prefer to read it, they can read it as well. So
excellent.
So it's paradox.substack.com.
Oops, I think I put it in the private chat by mistake. Yeah.
Oh, hold on. I'll take it out of there and I'm going to put it in. And we would be very happy to have you come back onto the show again if you are
Yeah.
so inclined to come back and give us more insight, because I feel your experience as a doctor is invaluable to anybody who's disputing any claims going on and praising these places like Alley Center or Beacon House. They don't stand at all reputable compared to you. Not in my mind. Not even close.
Well, that's very kind. I'm happy to chat anytime. I appreciate what you guys are doing. Thank you.
I kind of feel like we have a show every 5 minutes of all the different things that we covered. We could have made 20 shows out of all of these different topics and feel like we just touched the surface of this thing. So I would love to have more information from you. I find your information invaluable. I'm so thankful that you joined us, really. And on behalf of everybody else who's watching, thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And we invite you and your wife to come back, because it sounds like she is also an amazing person to have on the show as well.
She's smarter and better looking. So
we love to have her. Go girls.
Excellent. Well, we can't thank you enough. Again, thank you for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure to meet you. Thanks so much for coming on the show tonight. Take care.